Hi friends, welcome to Growing as Grown-Ups, where we believe each of us has the opportunity to keep growing in ways that can fundamentally improve our life effectiveness, our leadership influence, and our well-being. Through interviews, stories, and practical principles, we explore how you can accelerate your growth and unlock your potential to make the difference you want to make. And now, your hosts from the Leaders Lyceum, Dr. Sara Musgrove and Dr. Keith Eigel.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Growing as Grown-Ups podcast. Sara, really fun interview for part two, as you'll say in the interview with Dr. Nancy Popp from Boston.
Yeah, it was fun to get to meet her and to get to have a conversation with her on the heels of your conversation that I got to be curious about the things that came up that you guys talked about that I was like, let me ask some more. Let me ask different questions. Let me go down a different path. And you know, my bent in life is always to try to make things as applicable and practical as possible. Yeah. And so that was really my heart in going into the conversation with her, is how to take everything that she knows. She's such an expert in this field of adult development and how to understand and how to assess and how to coach in this area, and say, this is so complex. People are so complex, but what are the things that we can hold on to that are useful and helpful in the work that we do and in the leadership influence that our listeners want to have? And so it was really fun to hear her advice, her strategies, her thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, and I hope that for those of you that are listening, this whole series has, I think, definitely had a little bit more probably of an academic and theoretical bent to it. And but as Sara just mentioned, anything that captures the complexity of who we are as people sort of necessarily has to be complex itself. And, you know, Nancy is the first guest that we've had on like back-to-back episodes, and not just dividing an hour-long conversation into 2 30-minute segments. It's like almost two full hours with Nancy, a little bit shy of that. And the thing that I love about Nancy is that she, more than anyone else I know, has spent 35 years with really this as her singular focus, right? There have been other people who have done so much practicing of this out in the world or teaching other things, but it was 28 years ago or something that Nancy taught me the subject-object interview method. And the thing that was really fun for me in listening to the interview with you is that me and Carl Cooner and some others have been your primary frame of reference, where Nancy was kind of like Nancy and reading Keegan and a few meetings with him, he was my primary frame of reference. And kind of like the game of telephone, that there are things that get lost in the translation, and that was really fun for me. So folks, we're going to go ahead and let you listen to this interview, and Sara and I will come back at the end of this and give you our thoughts on some of the really key, fun, quotable points in this interview.
Welcome back to the Growing as Grown-Ups podcast, Dr. Nancy Popp. I know you are the first guest that we have had on 2 episodes. So we are excited to have you back to kind of extend what we talked about with you in the last episode. So thank you for making more time for our listeners.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, last time you and Keith, I gave him a hard time that you guys kind of geeked out on constructive developmental theory, adult development, vertical development, the subject-object interview, all that stuff, which is really fun for those of our listeners who love kind of the academic side of things.
Right.
But I always want to try to find the practical application of everything. And so that's kind of what we're talking about today.
Right.
And in constructive developmental theory, which is what all of this is based in, the model of adult development, these are all really complex theories. I mean, we were just talking about this. I've been working in this space for 10 years and I still have a hard time wrapping my head around it. And, you know, it would be great if we could get everybody trained up in the subject-object interview so that we could kind of know clearly where everybody that we interact with is on the journey, but that's a process. And so kind of what I want to talk to you today about is, thinking about our listeners who are leaders, who are out there in the midst of it, trying to have influence with people, trying to grow themselves. What applications can we make for them? So I just want to start out by asking you, why do you think it's valuable for people to understand this model in general? What value comes from them knowing that there is this process of growth that we go through?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I sort of have two different answers. One is that it goes way back, and I probably was talking about this with Keith. I said Keith when I was geeking out. That the reason that I became so enthralled with this theory was in my very first class with Bob Keegan, when he talked about how this is all about the importance of letting another person know that their experience matters. And, I still talk about this. It was, I hate to say how long ago it was, at least 35 years. It still brings tears to my eyes. And I remember sitting there and, feeling the tears coming to my eyes. And I thought, this is what I can really get into because it, it matters. And so that's kind of the foundation of why I think this is important, because it is at its heart, the theory and the measure, the SOI, are about understanding a person where they are now and how they see their own world. And so, to understand like the roadmap or this theory is, for both a practitioner who wants to understand a client or a employee or a colleague, or to try to understand yourself, it's like we have, if you have kids, we have these milestones for children's development, and which are really helpful because then it helps you to say, okay, my kid is doing all of these things and I know what's next. So it's like, kind of what to expect within the larger, kind of framework. And so the same thing with this roadmap is that it really helps to kind of know, what's next along this trajectory, or what's normal. I've had clients and students say, after they learn this, they say, oh my God, now I understand why this is so hard for me, because I have this 3-ish part of me that doesn't like conflict. So just knowing that gives them a sense that, okay, this is developmental. This is not like some flaw in my character or some, because I'm, stupid or because I'm not as good as somebody else about doing these things. It's because this is a developmental process. And here's the way to get better at it. So it gives you kind of a context. It also gives a language for people to understand what they're going through. And also it helps to give a language to what people are experiencing about other people that they find really troubling or frustrating or curious. It's like, I don't understand why this person doesn't get what I'm saying. Then when they understand that there's this developmental trajectory, it's like, okay, that's, they are here and I'm expecting them to be here. And it's a mismatch of expectations and capacity. So, I think it just gives this really wonderful context for saying there are people all along this continuum, and to just have the possibility that there are all these different ways of making sense of things. It kind of gives you more space to look at a person and say, okay, so how are they putting their world together? It may not be the same as what I'm doing. And so if I can just, not even knowing how it is or what stage they're at, but if I just know that they are putting their world together in a different way from me, then it makes me more curious about how they are, where they are. And then I can sort of say, oh, I was expecting them to do this, but this, so I think those are some of the reasons why I think that this theory is so helpful and important.
I love it. I mean, for the people that have been on the Growing as Grown-ups podcast journey with us, like curiosity and empathy are two things that the
Yeah.
more I do work in the space, the more I realize like those things are so crucial.
Yes.
And I love what you're saying about the idea of we need to recognize that everybody's experience matters, that we can't expect it to be the same as ours.
Right.
And I think it's easier when I think about it with my stepkids. I have two now high school stepkids.
Oh,
And right,
it
I
definitely
look at
helps with
them,
teenagers.
right.
Yeah.
And I get frustrated at times because I'm like,
Mhm.
you're not making sense. Like the things
Right.
that you're doing don't make sense. This doesn't, and my husband will try to appeal to their values and let's do the right thing. And to be able to go, okay, time out. He's still pretty level 2.
Right.
That's not what's going to motivate him, or for the
Right.
girl,
Right.
like it's all about what her friends are thinking. And
Yes.
so it
Yes.
helps with that, right? Because
Yes.
I expect teenagers to be at different levels. I think it gets
Yes.
more complicated with adults
Yes.
who I think you're about my age, you're about my experience level, you're about the same education level.
Mhm.
And so when you're thinking about how to try to figure out where other
Yeah.
adults are on the journey
Mhm.
without doing subject object interviews, what
Right.
are some of the things that we can be paying attention to
Mhm.
in other people around us, or even in ourselves, to try to
Yeah.
figure out where we
Yeah.
are on that journey?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that that's also a great question. um,
Thanks.
I think that, you know, the first thing I think about is to when you're finding yourself frustrated with somebody, to think about, okay, so what am I expecting? What are my assumptions and expectations, especially, and what are they not doing? What am I expecting them to do that they're not doing? So, to get clear about that. So, maybe I expect someone to be able to take their own perspective and not just, say, well, this is what this guy says, so that's the way it's got to be. And then I think, okay, so that's my expectation. They're not doing that. So maybe that's not something that they're able to do yet. So I, the first thing is to look at what your own expectations are.
Do my own expectations give me insight to my level?
Well, they can. I think it's really hard. But with this theory, it's it's almost like the answer to every question is it depends.
Right.
When I was learning this, like a billion years ago, I just remember walking down the street and like interviewing myself, like, what bothers you the most about this, Nancy? Why does that bother you the most? Like, so, it's just like driving myself crazy. Yeah. So it kind of depends on the capacity that you have to take a perspective on yourself.
Which maybe for people who are further on the journey, they can do that, but earlier stages, that's maybe asking a lot.
Yeah. So, it's, that depends.
All right. I pulled you off track. So you were talking about how when we get frustrated, we look at our own expectations of what the other person is or isn't doing. And compare those to them. Okay. Keep going with that thought.
So that's, take my own son. When he was younger, he has this incredible analytical intellect. And I would very often get so sort of caught up in that I would make assumptions about the way that he could take a perspective on things. And so I would think that he's more kind of emotionally, as advanced as his intellect. Well, no. And I would get caught up in that. It was like, wait a second, so it really is about what am I expecting that they're not doing? And then the other thing is, if it's an employee or a client or friend, where are they hesitant? What do they not want to do? Because that will often tell you what feels, each level of development has a different set of vulnerabilities. And, for shorthand, we can, look at the socializing and the self-authoring stage 3 and stage 4. But there's so many nuances and, the transitions in between. But in general, as you were talking about your stepdaughter, the stage 3 is a lot about what people think of me. But there are adults who were in their 50s, 60s who are making sense at that level.
Yeah, for sure.
So it may show up a little bit differently than it does in a high school kid. So where was I going with that?
The hesitancies that
here.
people,
Right.
people.
Okay, so if someone is really hesitant to give critical feedback to their partner, their employee, or whatever, that's something like, okay, so what's going on there? What's hard for you about giving critical feedback? And it may be about, I don't want to hurt their feelings. I don't want them to be mad at me. So that could indicate more of a sort of a socializing mindset. They could also say, I don't want to hurt their feelings, but on the other hand, they really need to know this so they can be better. So that sort of tells you that, maybe it's not just the socializing mindset, but there's another, there's some more, there's another perspective going on.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't always tell, and we'll talk more later about not being able to make generalized assumptions, but you can get ideas or sort of a generalized sense about, are they comfortable sort of challenging an authority or not? Are they comfortable engaging in conflict or not? What do they do when they're in conflict? And so those are the kinds of things that you can start to see where their sticking point is, and also your own. Like, conflict is a big issue, and I actually have. We'll talk about this at the end, but I wrote a paper with a colleague called "The Self in Conflict," looking at what conflict looks like at each one of these stages. So, so that's something that really pulls on people's, vulnerabilities, and you can understand a lot about someone from the ways that they look at conflict, whether it's, it's really hard, but it's really necessary. It's the only way you really get to, understand another person's perspective, or I hate conflict, I avoid it at all cost, and then there's everything in between. Or, sort of at the more concrete level, it's a conflict is because you're doing it wrong and I'm right, so, it's as simple as that.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that we talk about when we're teaching this model is the challenge that you can't take any one behavior
Yes.
and say, because they did this, you could do any behavior from any level.
Yes, exactly.
It's what's going on in their head that makes it, that determines. And that's the hard thing. And especially when you layer in values, it's easy to think people with good social norm values are like level 4, even higher stages of level 3. But then people with like selfish values who value power and wealth and success are lower levels. But it's like, we're listening to a story about a level 2 person who had all the right values, but it's like, ooh, with enough time that starts to unravel, but it just makes it tricky. And I think that's one of the things I find most complicated is behavior doesn't tell you anything. And so that kind of leads into my next question that you started to get at is, are there questions? Because I find, and you tell me if this is true or not, that asking specific types of questions or targeted questions helps me get a better sense more than observing behavior. And you already said a couple, which was what's hard about that for you? Or when asking yourself, why does that bother me?
Yeah.
So what do you think about like questions, and what kind of questions are helpful at kind of peeling back the behavior that somebody exhibits to understand what that behavior is meaning to them?
Right. Yeah, I mean, there are the kind of SOI questions that you can ask, like, what did that mean to you? And what was most important to you in that?
And what are you listening for with those kinds of questions?
Well, what I'm listening for is what kind of perspective they can take on their own behavior and thinking. In the very generalized way, again, if someone says, well, because those are the rules, then, and if they can't sort of explain any more than that, then that would tell me something, that there's, a pretty concrete, literal understanding of what they're supposed to do. So it really is about the kind of perspective that they can take. How much responsibility do they take for their own behavior? Can they say, yeah, that probably wasn't such a good idea, but here's why I did it? Or can they, is it more, I don't know why I did it. I mean, there's so many things, but, when it's just about behavior, I mean, yeah, it's like, what was your thinking behind that?
I can imagine conversations that leaders have with their employees all the time that could go beyond those kind of the typical conversations they have, and kind of get at that. Why is that important to you? What's hard about that for you? What are you worried about? Any of those kind of sense-making questions.
Yeah. Or, I mean, a good SOI question is, what are you most worried about? Because that makes them kind of dig into not just what they worry about, but what's most, kind of helps get down more into the core of things. And, kind of more general questions about, how to try to understand where someone's coming from. I mean, you asked me earlier to think about, if you're interviewing a potential, like a candidate for a position, to ask someone, how comfortable or not are you giving critical feedback, and receiving critical feedback? How do you deal with conflict? What happens when something that you feel very strongly about, someone disagrees very strongly? How do you engage with that person around that disagreement? Those kinds of things that get at, how many perspectives can you take and hold at the same time? I mean, I think that really perspective taking capacity is really kind of at the heart of what you're looking for.
That's really good.
Yeah.
So all the examples you just gave are asking people to kind of put themselves in these tense situations, right? Conflict, disagreement.
Yeah.
Does it work on the other side to kind of unpack values, or, kind of the idea of what is success to you, or what's your idea of leadership, or those kinds of things? Can that give, it seems like that might be easier for people to give kind of the textbook answer, but.
Yes. Yeah, it is. I mean, that's one of the things that is hard. I mean, when you ask about a tense or a vulnerable situation, it gets at where people feel most vulnerable, and that's kind of where you get. I mean, yes, you can get it, but you also run the risk, as you said, of getting the textbook. Leadership is blah 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 blah. And then you have to sort of say, well, how do you know that? How do you know that this is the best way to do something? it's one of the things that I have come to understand is that we don't, that conflict in these vulnerable, tense situations are what make us grow.
Yeah.
Because if everything's comfortable and nice, then there's no challenge. I mean, Keegan talks about that growth is about the optimal balance of challenge and support. That if there's no challenge, there's no impetus to do anything different. And on the other hand, if it's over challenging and there's no support, then you get really very easily kind of overwhelmed and discouraged, and you just tune out. So as much as we might not like those really, difficult conversations and difficult moments, that's where, you're kind of forced to stretch your meaning making capacities to make it bigger so that you can fit this contradiction that right now is kind of ripping you apart. Yeah. So that's getting way off target.
No, but it's so good. And it supports so much of what we talk about with our clients and on this podcast, is that the challenging opportunities we face in life are what give us the opportunity for growth, because it does say the way I'm making sense of the world right now isn't working.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
And take advantage of that. But I do want to ask you then on the support piece, if I'm a coach or if I'm a boss and I have an employee that I can see is in one of these vulnerable situations, something's being asked of them that is beyond their current kind of, as you said in the last podcast, their center of balance, we're kind of pushing them off. What can we do to support growth? And let's kind of focus it maybe in that 3 to 4 transition, because that is where it seems like so many people, at least that I work with and that the Lyceum works with.
Yeah.
I have my favorite questions, but I'd love to learn from you. What kind of support can we give that doesn't take away the challenge, but doesn't knock them completely over?
Right. Well, I like to start with what they feel strong and comfortable with. Like you're great with people. You have a good sense of empathy, and you really want to help them. So this is, someone who's in that 3 to 4 transition. And then sort of say, and that is also, that's one of your greatest strengths. It's also kind of getting in your way of being able to provide feedback that might help that person, go a step farther. So now I'm getting confused. Did you ask the question about how I would help a client do that, or how I would help?
Okay. What advice would you give to people that are coaching, which I'm assuming would be also in line with what you would do?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, again, you want to, going back to that their experience matters. You want to let that person know that their experience matters, that you notice that they're struggling, and that their struggle tells you something important about them. It tells you what they're good at, and it tells you what they're not very comfortable or confident in what they're good at. But if that thing that they're not comfortable with is something that is a necessary part of their position or their job, then, we need to find a way to help you be able to do that. And so, we create scaffolds. So you start with something that you're really good at, that you feel like, yes, this feels authentic to me. This feels where I can do my best work. And so how do you start with that kind of basis and then take the next step? And, depending on where they are, the next step is going to look really different. So can you say they have, they're right in the middle of that transition. So there's some self-authoring running and there's some socializing running. Then it's like, so how can you use that, your independent self-authoring voice, to kind of help you be a little more, direct in your communication? So you really care about people, but you're maybe not communicating in the most direct way. So how can you, kind of use those two things to to kind of make your communication that much more effective.
I like that. And I have never thought about that strategy in terms of somebody's vertical development. We teach that a lot in terms of personality. Like how do you leverage your personality strengths and preferences to do the
Right.
things that are naturally hard for you, but to use kind of their perspective taking ability also, I think is a good
Yeah.
addition. Sounds like it's minimizing it a little bit, but
Yeah, well, I think that, what I have said a lot is that it feels good to grow, and people who are kind of paying attention and they're struggling, when they get a sort of a toehold on something that works better, it feels really good. I mean, we're not like kids who say, oh, yay, look, I can reach the faucet now or something, but there is a kind of sense in there. And I probably said this with Keith too. There is a sense in there that like, oh my God, this is great. It's like opens up this whole new world. Like now I can, engage in conflict without feeling like I'm going to implode. So for someone who is struggling with that, to have a sense like there's a part of me that knows exactly how to do it, but I'm afraid to do it. But if I understand, going back to the first question you asked, if I understand this roadmap, then I see that part of me that knows what to do is actually growing. And I can leverage that, or I can support myself in that. And, so there's a kind of innate motivation to keep going. And I think that's, when you understand where a person is and what their developmental struggle is, then they feel like, wow, I can take this and I can do something with it. I sort of know, like, I know why this is really hard for me. And I know that this is where I can go with it. So, you can set up little practices, where you can help a person start to say no more instead of feeling like they're obligated to do something. So it's, it's kind of giving them permission to think about, what, if I didn't worry about this other part, what would I do? And then how can I help myself? So you really start an internal conversation with the person about how I can set up my own scaffolds.
Yeah. I mean, that it's part of the way that we work with our clients with what we call the growth gap tool and taking small steps, which is an adaptation of the 4 columns exercise.
Right.
But this idea of naming the assumptions, which are for the most part rooted in a fear of, I'm assuming if I do this, bad things could happen, and then testing it in a safe way. And I love when I hear stories of people who come back and say, oh, that wasn't as scary as I thought it was going to be. Right. But when fear just lives inside of us, it seems so powerful.
Yeah. And, and all of these developmental levels have different kinds of fear. So the fear that someone feels in a full socializing mindset is very different from the fear that someone at, full self-authoring feels. And, somebody full self-author, they still feel plenty of fear. It's just a different kind. It takes a different shape.
Yeah.
So,
and that's why I think it's so important for people to understand this. And Bob talked about this a whole lot in his episode, is the 2 parts of growth, the excitement of growth and the fear of, the way he talked about it is the fear of dying.
Exactly.
And it's what I always say, it's why New Year's resolutions don't work, because we just think about the fun of the growth and we don't go, but why have you been struggling with that for so long?
Exactly. Yes.
And the power that comes with naming both the fear and the growth vision that I have, and how much more powerful that is. So
yeah.
I think it's just, our people have heard it, but I just don't think people can hear it enough, because it's so much easier to just think about, oh, I want to get bolder. I want to be more confident in conflict. Cool.
Right. Yeah.
But those fears are still going to say, run away,
Right.
danger
Don't
zone.
do it. Danger.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
let me ask you this, right? What we do is so complicated, right?
Mhm.
And all of your, it depends. I love it because it just shows that this is not easy work.
Mhm.
But part of what we want to do is empower people to know the model, to take steps,
Mhm.
to use what they can.
Right.
But there's a little risk of becoming an armchair expert, right?
Yes. Yes.
I've
Yeah.
had clients who come back, we teach our leader level model. And then I hear reports that they're sitting in the office going, you're being so level too. I'm like, I don't think that's how we went. So I know
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
something that you have thoughts about too, but
Yes.
we've talked about the advantages of understanding how adults grow in this developmental model and all of these things. What are the things that we need to be cautious of as
Mhm. Yeah.
even and our listeners try to take this out and use it to help themselves and others grow?
Right. Yeah. I think, that's a huge question. And it's one of the things that I kind of rail against, like every person I work with. It's, because on one hand, it's a context that helps us understand. And we like to understand things. People in general like to be able to put a label on something because then you can sort of have a relationship to it. You can say, okay, I know what
Yeah.
you are. I know what that is. That's why we have all this taxonomy, because I want to know what kind of bird that is. And I want to know what kind of tree that, it's all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So, and that's a really good thing. Where I think the problem comes is that once we identify that, we like to sort of say, okay, that's the way it is. You like to solidify it so that, it's like it gives me this sense of solidity and comfort in the world that I know how to categorize these things. But the problem is it doesn't allow for people to grow. And it also, like you're saying that people come back and say you're acting so level 2. Well, it's also the same as, that person is just like totally a 2. I mean, that drives me nuts because they are not a 2. It's not,
Yeah.
the number does not define the person.
Right.
The number is a code to tell us about how this person is making sense. But once we say, oh, that person's a 2, everything that we see and think and say about that person goes through that lens of they're a 2 and this is what 2s do. And then that person has lost all of their personhood and they become this projection of my own assumptions and biases and all kinds of stuff. So it
becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. And as much as this theory is about helping people to understand or letting people know that their experience matters, doing that kind of dehumanizes them and saying it doesn't matter because I figured you out and this is what you are to me, which is the opposite of that. And, with a hierarchical stage theory, that's a really easy thing to slip into.
Yeah.
And so, I see a lot of danger in that. And I, to a certain extent, there's nothing that you can do. People were going to take this theory in as they do, and they're going to use it the way they do. But what I am passionate about and committed to is saying this is not about defining or prescribing people. This is about describing the way that they see the world, the way they make sense of things, so that you can then work with them better, not judge them more. And, so the hierarchical thing it's a double-edged sword because, everything in nature is hierarchical. Things that grow, it's a hierarchical process. It gets more complex as it grows. There's, and there's nothing, it's like an acorn turns into an oak tree. There's nothing more valuable about an oak tree than there is about an acorn. But, so it just, people get into this thing like, oh, you're making judgments about people, but it's not that. It's about understanding, again, I'm sort of geeking out again here, but it's really about how well is this person able to live and work within the context and the various social contexts that they are. And if they're not, then there's, the balance, there's a mismatch, which is not good for anybody. And so this is, intended to help people, find a better balance and a better fit. And so,
it goes to me, what I'm hearing you say is it goes back to empathy, but more than that, this idea of kind of checking your motives, right? Am I wanting to understand where somebody is so that I can validate their experience more completely and help them figure out what the right next step for them is? Or am I trying to figure out where they are on the journey to put them in a box, to label them? And I can't even imagine that could be done in a way that isn't some sort of self-benefiting process of you. If I'm labeling you level 2, it's probably because I think I'm level 4 and I'm better than you, right? And so it goes back to, is it about helping people, caring about their experience, really creating that connection? And I love that that you have made that point so passionately, that it's not really a better or worse, it's just an understanding.
Yeah. And it also works at the other end where people who know this theory can understand it's it's like, oh, I think I must be level 5 because I care about everybody in the world and I, have this really inclusive worldview. So I must be there. And that's not any good either, because then you're not, it's like you can't grow if you're not grounded where you are.
Really good.
And so if you think that you're somewhere where you're not, then you're spending all of your time to prove to yourself and everybody else how evolved you are. And it's kind of obvious that you're not.
It's like, that sounds like you're probably level 3 if that is what you're doing.
Well, who knows, but so it's really, it's a challenge to get away from the sort of judgmentalness of, the higher is better dilemma. And, if you want to be a world leader, it is better to be have a more complex mindset. But that doesn't mean you're any more valuable a person.
I love that.
So,
and to me, it's growing is better, right?
Yes.
It's better to be a person who's at a lower stage who is growing than a person at a higher stage who sat down and said, I'm good. I don't need to go anymore. I'm level 4. I'm great.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I know how things work now.
Yeah. I figured out who I am.
Yeah.
So Nancy, as we kind of wrap up, what resources would you recommend for people who do want to continue to learn more and study this? And, I guess as a subset of that, if there are people who, and I've had a couple of people ask me over the years, like, how do they get trained in subject-object interview? How do they learn more about that? And then what resources for people who do want to understand, how do I understand other people? How do I understand myself? How do I keep growing? What are the things that you love for yourself and to share with the people that you're working with?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll give a little plug. I do teach people how to do the interview.
Okay, so we can send them straight to you, and we gave them your contact information last time.
Yes.
So perfect.
Yeah. No, I have some colleagues, and we have it's a long program, but it really, because it's important. I mean, it's a challenging, difficult theory to learn, and it's even harder to do the assessments. It really is. And it's so worth it. It's very time consuming. It's very work intensive. But I mean, I think it's so important. I just love it. And so I get a lot of energy and happiness from training people. So yeah, so they can get in touch with me. And you know, the book that I still love the most is Bob Keegan's The Evolving Self. And you know, people say, oh my God, it's so hard to slog through that. And I agree. But the way he is so careful with language and words that if you just slow down and read it, it's just beautiful, you know. And In Over Our Heads is also good because it kind of explains the whole expectation of society for people to be somewhere where they're not. So, you know, that's a really good book too, to kind of see how this looks in the bigger world.
You referenced a paper that you wrote. Is that something that people can access somewhere?
Yeah. It's called The Self in Conflict.
If you can find it and send me the link, we can link it.
I could send you a link, or I could send you I could actually send you a copy.
Oh,
or
yeah. Could we put that on our website for people to download?
Yeah.
Perfect. We'll put that on the Growing Grownups website.
Yeah, that would be great. I'm really proud of that article because I think that, you know, there's the content that we make sense of, and then there's a structure with how we make sense. And conflict is like I said earlier, it's a juicy content. And I think this it lays out how the same content is made sense of differently. So I think it gives people a kind of a real sense of how these stages actually look in real life.
I'm excited to read it. So that'll be great.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Well, Nancy, so fun. I appreciate it. Is there anything else as we wrap up that you think you'd love to share with our listeners? Words of wisdom, advice, words of warning?
Well, I think I've given a lot of those already. One thing that I am excited about is that the colleagues that I'm working, you know, that we have the training session for the SOI, we're also putting together kind of a supervision course for coaches in terms of using the SOI as a tool in the coaching to help, you know, kind of, help their clients grow. So it's going to be a real hands-on. You bring in an interview from a client, and then we go through it and talk about how, you know, where are the places where you can really, you know, set up a scaffold here, and what are the content areas that you could really help. So that's something that I love doing. I'm really, you know, in my own work, that's what really, you know, turns my lights on. So
I love it. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, we're still just, you know, putting it together, but hopefully that's going to come together soon. And, you know, I can let you guys know when it's ready and people want to have a look.
That'd be great. Hey, you may find me in your class, so you may get to hang out.
I love that. Yeah, no,
Nancy,
it's so fun, Sarah. Thank you so much. As you can tell, I get so energized talking about this that it's really fun for me. So.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. You have been more than generous, and I hope that our people come and check out your work, and maybe you'll get to train some of the Growing as Grownups listeners. Make sure, listeners, if you guys are interested, tell Nancy you came from us. That'd be super fun.
Yes, great. Thank you. All right.
Have a great rest of your day, Nancy.
Thank you. You too.
Sara, what a fun interview with Nancy. Again, there's something, and again, I don't know if this is going back to like, I wasn't a child, but like my childhood, but just hearing her voice makes me happy. Just the way that she laughs about things and the way that she listens, and then there's a pause, and then she'll laugh, and then she'll say, yeah, it's kind of like that, right? It was so much fun for me to hear. But I tell you, one of the early kind of takeaways in y'all's conversation was just a great, clear reminder that we are not the same. right? Developmentally, we may be at similar levels, and there may be some similar sort of uh, elements of the way that we're making sense of the world, but we're still different. And you and I have talked and mentioned on several podcasts in the past the importance of meeting others where they are and not getting them to meet us where we are. And but Nancy brings such almost a mission or passion to this that almost like if we're using constructive developmental theory, if we're using vertical development or leader levels for anything other than making people's lives better, we're misusing it in a way. So I don't know what, as you listen back to it, and as you did it, what stood out to you the most?
I mean, it's a continuation of what you just said, which is Nancy's passion that is so evident about the reason she is so drawn to this and so invested in this all comes back to making sure that people know that their experience matters. And so like just the sense of like, I know you, I see you, I want to understand you, the amount of care and compassion that is in that mentality obviously resonates to me because of my personality and my orientation in life, and you as well. But just this idea of, by understanding this model, by trying to figure out where somebody is on the journey, is not at all to label somebody or to even like understand their behavior, but it's to say, I want to understand you so I can come alongside you on the journey that you're on and help you take the next step. And so this idea of, and we talk about it in the interview, but it's not even just leaders in an organization, but it goes to parenting, it goes to friends, sure. Any relationship where you are invested in somebody, to say, I want to understand where you're coming from in your experience, and then work with you to scaffold a plan going forward, starting with what it is that you are bringing to the table that you're good at, that you're comfortable with, that you're strong at, and saying, okay, if this is what you have to leverage, how do we leverage that in order to help you take that step that seems overwhelming and scary?
Yeah.
And I think one thing that Nancy and I talked about after the recording that she's like, oh, shoot, I should have mentioned this, is she talks about that growing feels good. It's fun and it feels good to grow. But she said, that's not also honoring what Keegan talked about of it's scary and it can feel like a death. And so the both and nature of when you're first starting out, it feels so scary and you need that scaffolding to keep you safe. But she talked about once you get a toehold in where you're growing, it is fun. And you're like, oh, this isn't as scary as I thought. There's actually a lot to be gained if I keep going in the momentum. And so she wanted me to recognize that she also agreed with Bob that it's really scary and it feels good.
Yeah. And growth begets growth. I mean, I've seen that forever in our programs, that growth begets growth. And when you start to break free a stuckness that has been in place for a really long time, that is energizing. And it gives you hope, and it realizes that the assumptions that you hold about what will happen if you do or don't do something are a lot of times just assumptions. And y'all's conversation around that was really fun for me as well. I tell you, one of the things that really jumped out at me in kind of a new way was this idea that at each level we have our own vulnerabilities. Yeah. Right. We have our own fears, and it's a different set of fears. And there was a real tangibility to that in terms of meeting people where they are, maybe understanding the model deeply enough that you know the right questions to ask. Right. And we can talk, if you want, in a minute about kind of, again, what I've always called the superlative nature of questions. What's most hard about that, or what's most important to you? But to tap into this idea that those vulnerabilities and those fears and the things that hold us in place differ for each of us, not only depending on kind of who we are and how we're built, but where we are on this vertical journey and where we are in our maturity. And one of the things that struck me is, we've had clients who have taken this and they have fun with it, right? And for the most part, it's good-natured fun. Things like, I'm getting ready to go all level 2 on you, or things like that. But folks, and those of you that I'm talking to, you know who you are. Some of you kid harder than others, and there's a little more bite in your kidding. And one of the things that I thought of that you guys didn't say, I thought, what if we treated the people around us when we're in the middle of the vertical journey the same way we would want them to treat our children? Right? Because I know that when I'm with my child and I understand a vulnerability that they have that I've long since grown past, right? That I treat that with tenderness and care. I am not like, oh, that is so immature. That's so dumb. And yet,
Right.
Sarah, when we get in a room of adults, even if we recognize that there's earlier career, later career, even though we recognize there's stages, a lot of times we fall into this trap of, hey, we're all grown-ups here, but we're not all grown-ups at the same place. I think if this series has made anything more clear than we've already tried to make it, it's that very thing.
Yeah. And something else that she brought up at the end of our conversation that I know she talked about with you once you guys stopped recording is this idea of the hierarchical nature of the model, that there is this progression. And we just had somebody the other day get kind of emotionally reactive to us kind of posing that, level 2 as an adult is not effective at best and destructive at worst. And that level 5 is kind of the ultimate destination. But I think she made a really great point that it's not their value as a person, right? There's no difference in worth as a human being, but it's a matter of the person environment fit. So if somebody is level 2, they can fit really well in an environment where they are doing certain tasks or meeting certain expectations that are more about kind of clear black and white, do what's expected of me and get rewarded. But as she said, if you're looking for someone to be a world leader, the complexity that's required with that, you need somebody with the more complex perspective of the world. And so, she makes the point that it's like everything in nature, that there is this progression. And I think progression is a better word than hierarchy per se, but she talks about the acorn versus the tree, and an acorn, it has a purpose that it does really well. And every oak tree comes from an acorn, but you can't make a table out of an acorn, right?
Yeah.
If you're trying to make a table, you need the more complex, mature version of that cycle. So I just thought that was an interesting thing and something that we hear sometimes, and maybe just because we heard it 2 days ago, I was like, that's worth discussing, that it's not in any way that your worth as a person is determined where you are in the journey. Behavior is not better or worse. It's just, does the complexity with which you can understand the world match what is required of you in your environment?
Yeah. I mean, this is, again, I don't know how you get people who are maybe not oriented this direction to fully buy into this, but I got a feeling that most of the people who would take time to listen to this podcast are already there. So I'm grateful for that. But she said very clearly, even in this episode, she said, the oak tree has no more inherent value than the acorn. Right. And when we can apply that principle to the people around us, but recognize, and I'm kind of a landscape fan in my life.
You're the one I call when I have questions about trees and shrubs.
And the way I take care of a sapling or a young tree that we've just put in is very different than the way you begin to take care of and prune a tree that is beginning to grow and take shape, which is very different than the way you care and take care of an oak tree that is maybe 80 or 100 or 150 years old. It is, all of them get treated differently. They all do different things. And, but for me, the value in not just saying, well, hey, I'm a sapling, right? And the value in saying, I need to grow is, I don't think parenting, work, society, politics, pick a topic. None of it's getting simpler. I mean, it's all getting more complex at a rate that is hard for us to keep our arms around. And so the idea that we would push ourselves, that, as Nancy said so well, there's a part of the great thing about understanding the roadmap and the SOI interview is you can almost begin to SOI interview yourself. Like when Nancy was saying, man, when I'd just be walking down the street and I'd be thinking about, why did I do that? Why did I say that? What was most important to me about that?
Yeah.
Is that the whole reason Sara and I are even doing this podcast is because we want us to grow, and we want accelerated growth. We don't want to just wait for the growth that's going to happen if life beats us up enough.
Yeah.
But how can we get ahead of that curve? Because the complexity in every aspect of our life is only increasing. And as she said, this, Keegan's book on In Over Our Heads, The Mental Demands of Modern Life, did such a good job explaining that all of us, to some degree, are feeling in over our heads. What's being demanded of us is more than, a lot of times, the way we're making sense of or constructing reality in the world or understanding of ourselves. It exceeds that.
Yeah. I think that reminds me of the last thing that stood out to me in her and what she said that I just love, that is kind of what I want to hold on to, is she said, you can't grow if you're not grounded where you are. Right? If I'm spending all of my time trying to convince you that I'm an 80-year-old oak tree and look at all my leaves and look how they're changing colors and they're so great, and I'm really just a young sapling, I'm not going to grow because I'm not doing what needs to be done. And so if we can't be honest with ourselves about where we are on this journey, we're not going to be able to grow because we're not going to have the right next steps.
Yeah.
And so just this idea of like, it's complex, all these things, but just start with trying to gain that awareness of where am I so that I can grow, because that's the goal. Is we want people to continue to grow and evolve and keep up with the world so that they can keep making contributions.
Yeah. And we talked about this on other episodes, but there are, just happiness, satisfaction, well-being, not to mention effectiveness. And I love that you drew special attention to this point. It's not getting to some places as though it's a destination. The real joy and it comes in the growing.
Yeah.
So start wherever you are right now on the journey. The quicker you can acknowledge that and begin to put things in place, I think it's better. One thing before we close this segment out real quick is that, I'm sure you guys heard it in the episode, but I think Nancy gave us a lot of encouragement to maybe, as we're trying to really understand what matters to people, that there are better and worse questions to get there. Right. And the more that you can start thinking about, how do I get at the thing that's not easy for them? What's most hard? What's most difficult? What is what's most important to them? This kind of those superlative questions, but also the idea of getting to the more difficult things, like not shy away from, tell me more about that conflict. Yeah. As opposed to tell me more about where you want to go in your career, right? And I love the way you ask those questions around that. And folks, for those of you that are coaches that listen to this podcast, for those of you all that have a really strong coaching mindset, I would encourage you to look into the program that Nancy and her colleagues are building to really go in depth about understanding the model and how to do the interview and how to assess this more accurately. And just feel free to reach out to her. She's opened that door. Ways to get in touch with her will be in the show notes.
Yeah, if you go to growinggrownups.com, we'll have her email address. We probably won't put it in the show notes because that's a lot of public access to her email address, but go there. Also, in the spirit of really taking the effort to understand where people are coming from. While you're on their website, go to our resources page, and we have the Self on the Shelf guide that really can help you learn how to listen to people differently, to pull back and get to what really matters to them. And we talk about it a lot in the context of seeking feedback, but it is great in these kind of situations where it's like, I really want to understand where you're coming from, in a good way to listen through that process.
Yeah, listening in a Self on the Shelf way, little secret for you guys, just gets people to say more than they would have said otherwise. And so a great companion reference to this. It fits just totally hand in glove with this. So listen, I think on the next episode, I think Carl Kunert and I are going to try and have a conversation that pulls these 4 episodes together, and we'll look forward to your wisdom to interpret what Carl and I may have actually said.
That will be a big undertaking.
It will be a big undertaking. All right, guys.
Until next time, journey well.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Growing as Grown-Ups. Take a second and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any future episodes, and tell your friends. You'll find all of the goods related to this episode, including the transcript, videos, links, and other ways we can help you keep growing as a grown-up on our website, growinggrownups.com. Growth isn't easy, but it's completely within your reach. Until next time, journey well, friends.